If solicitors cannot be trusted, the rule of law breaks down. Clients will not confide in us. Contracts will not be entered into as not worth the paper they're written on. Litigants will represent themselves, and those suspected of criminal offences will stay silent and plead not guilty, whatever the truth might be. Without trust, frankly, there is anarchy.
A Kratos team was scrambled, but their vehicles were low on fuel and they had to stop to refuel on their way to Stockwell, putting them behind the curve. Their suspect picked up a free newspaper, used his Oyster card to go through the barriers at Stockwell, and walked down the escalator until he heard an approaching train, and he ran down the last few steps, as one tends to do, to make sure that you get your train. It was the officers wearing heavy coats to disguise the arms that they had underneath, who vaulted over the ticket barriers and ran down the escalators. Witnesses subsequently confused their actions with those of the suspected suicide bomber. The rules of Operation Kratos, the policy document, did not, at the time, require a definitive code word or trigger word to be used to authorize a preemptive strike. So there was none for the senior designated officer to give. The policy stated that if the armed officers believed they had authority from the designated senior officer, if they honestly believed that this was a suicide bomber with a bomb that he would detonate unless they took him by surprise, they should shoot him in the back of the head without any warning. If they were in any doubt, they should shout a warning and react according to how the suspect reacted to that warning. So the armed officers believed that they had the authority of the designated senior officer, which she says she did not give. The armed officers say they did shout a warning, but no one else in the crowded underground carriage heard that warning. Jean-Charles de Menezes, a slim young man wearing a T-shirt and a light denim jacket, carrying nothing but a copy of the Metro, was being held in a bear hug by a surveillance officer when he was fatally shot. Where was the bomb that was about to blow them all up? On the other hand, London was described at the time as being on a war footing, and in the fog of war, terrible mistakes happen. About 5 hours after the shooting, I went to see the Commissioner's two closest advisors, his staff officer and his chief of staff, to find out what was going on. I was the acting assistant commissioner at the time. When I asked them what was happening, I was told, we've shot a Brazilian tourist, and we found a Brazilian driver's license in his back pocket. It was actually the Home Office pathologist who found a Brazilian identity document in the back pocket of Jean-Charles de Menezes on the train before the body was moved. A press conference was held, and the public impression given was that we had shot a suicide bomber. But immediately after the press conference, I attended a crisis meeting, a gold group, with the head of counter-terrorism, who called for a community impact assessment to be drawn up on the basis that we had shot an innocent Brazilian. We were told what the suspect's name was. My evidence clearly put the Commissioner in a difficult position. Did his closest advisors know but not tell him? Or did he know on the day and mislead everyone? The former Commissioner will say that he lost confidence in me for an unrelated, unproven, and relatively minor allegation of whistleblowing, nothing to do with the Stockwell incident. But whatever undermined his confidence, I was sidelined and inevitably forced out of the police service. Whether we're talking about apparently altering the statements of witnesses in the Hillsborough disaster, failing to take action against sexually predatory clergy, allowing members of Parliament to get away with falsely claiming expenses in order to supplement inadequate salaries, may all have seemed the right thing to do at the time. But short-term gain can result in long-term pain. that is far more damaging than the initial misconduct or mistake. We are all acutely aware that the actions of a tiny minority can cast doubt on the integrity of a whole profession. But I passionately believe that owning up is far better in the long term than covering up.
The general theme is owning up to mistakes. But I think it would be quite interesting at this stage to just bear in mind that there are different sorts of mistakes. There are the sort of mistakes we make which are genuine mistakes, and which we can all do. And it's not because we're bad or naughty, we just make mistakes sometimes. There are sort of mistakes we make which I thought about when Lord Paddick was talking about the Kratos team whose cars hadn't actually got enough petrol in to get to the emergency. That's a sort of mistake which anybody can make, but it's got an element of negligence and fault. And then there is a sort of mistake we can make, which is actually when we're doing something wrong and willfully flouting the rules. And I think the way we treat these mistakes is quite possibly going to be a little bit different. What if the innocent mistake actually leads to some very serious damage? Somebody dies. We've been downstairs talking about medical mistakes, and that can lead to very serious consequences. So do we actually judge a mistake on the intent of the person making it, or on the consequence of the mistake?
People are looking for a sense of justice to be dispensed, and that justice might well be a well thought out and truly honest sorry. And that's sometimes all that's required. So for those that were in the medical, in the workshop that focused on healthcare, may well have had the opportunity to talk about clinical negligence cases and how often, particularly parents in maternity cases, will simply want to have a commitment from their healthcare provider in that instance that it won't happen again and that they're sorry. No money in the world is ever going to bring your child back. And actually, they're not after the money. They're after some sense of justice. And that justice is an appreciation of a wrong that's been done and an appreciation of a responsibility that was left foul. But to come to this point of trust, what we do need is a system where if you're at fault, you don't fight it just because you think you can get away, because that's where you end up in an ever-increasing cycle of larger liabilities, because you end up litigating far longer in far more complex ways. And there will be legal opinions one way or the other as to whether or not that is in the best interest of your clients. But if you set that within the context of society's sense of how the justice system is working for it and their trust in the profession of the law, do we think that that's necessarily actually helping us in the long run? I would offer not.
There is a difference between your own mistake and reporting on somebody else's mistake. I very much believe that when it comes to genuine mistakes, or we should have an adverse incident reporting system. We have it in rail, we have it in air transport. It's a no-blame culture. It's intended to be positive. You report yourself and you can report somebody else. A genuine mistake. That's totally different from serious wrongdoing. That's not a mistake. Brian Paddick has actually referred to that. We mustn't put the two together.
You know, whistleblowing does take a huge amount of moral courage, and it means that you have an ethical anchor which you feel, you know, that you need to voice, and that's absolutely right and proper, and you should speak up. But that same moral courage, that same ethical leadership is required of those who need to say sorry. So they're two sides of the same coin in that sense. And I thought some of the points that Brian made earlier were absolutely right. First of all, that politics obscure truth and justice. He said that. And I think that most of our politicians lack the moral courage and the ethical leadership to say sorry. So in the political leadership of that time, there should have been a political apology. He also said that truth tellers get victimized. And I think that, again, that the way if you flip that is that those responsible for obscuring the truth should be the ones to give the apology.
Leadership from the top is very important in maintaining a culture of openness. You know, ideal world would all speak up, no retaliation, whatever. That's not how it is the whole time. But all the codes of practice, all the good practice nationally and internationally about introducing procedures and getting the right culture, changing the culture, says the leadership has to come from the top. It's not just a piece of paper. that the leadership must be out there saying, this is what we want to do, what we want you to do, you won't suffer retaliation. On the apology thing, it's quite interesting. Is an apology meaningful if somebody complains of harassment and you apologise to them, but the person who has done the harassing remains in the organisation stroke government? So, you've got to deal with the situation.
Yes.
An apology can still leave the wrong uncorrected. Also, I think we have to think when we talk here about mistakes and whatever, I think what a colleague in the audience has mentioned, we've got to distinguish leaks from whistleblowing. And leaks can be done deliberately, and indeed we associate leaks with political leaks before we even have whistleblowing legislation. Whistleblowing does not equal retaliation. We talk in this room as though whistleblowers are defined by retaliation. I don't accept that at all. The newspapers are full of stories about whistleblowers who've suffered retaliation. They never report successful whistleblowing for very good reasons. We all know the reasons why nobody researches into that. But I have got reason to believe that in certain sectors, banking, health service, whatever, there's a lot of successful whistleblowing, and we must bear that in mind.
Mm-hmm. Yes, Robert.
Well, ultimately, it's a behavioural thing. A mutual friend and former FT colleague of yours, Stefan Stern, wrote in the FT a few weeks ago, if leaders want to be more trusted, here's a tip, don't do bad things. And it's funny, but it's true. And I think a lot of this is deeply behavioural. I've often said that trust is not a message, it's an outcome, and part of the problem with those apologies is that they are crafted messages, often compromised crafted messages, and I've sat in rooms with loads of PR people and loads of lawyers crafting those messages, which is probably why I'm referred to as a repentant spinner.
It's not like the good old days where they give you a really big apple crumble or a really big anything. You know, sometimes you get these little trios that come now. So a little chocolate bomb thing, a little bit of this and a little bit of that. So I thought, well, why don't we just do that? So why don't we have 3 little trios in this little bit of our section? So we're going to have a first little trio which will be thinking ethically, and we'll think a little bit about ethics. Then in our next little trio, we are going to do something called the marriage of client care and customer service, just a little bit. And then in the last bit, we're literally going to throw everything up in the air and ask ourselves, so come on, why don't we just own up?
I think you can really see where transparency and risk management, they are sort of interlinked very closely, and there's some very clear examples where it really, when it's not done properly, it really does affect your business.
For us, the failings of law firms so far are unsupported IT systems. It's amazing how many firms are acting on ancient software that can't be patched, that's not up to date. They don't have sufficient firewalls, they don't train their staff, there's very little. So for example, one of the things that we do quite regularly with our clients, we send them phishing emails and then we monitor who clicks on them, who opens them, and then we tell them, do you know that this person has opened an attachment? And it's usually my face saying buy cyber insurance.
So the idea of metaphorical speed cameras, like whistleblowers, are universally unpopular. However, they're put there for a reason. Nobody actually puts a speed camera in the middle of a place where nobody speeds. And the speed camera and the whistleblower have been known to reduce road traffic accidents, deaths in hospital. They've heightened awareness of very serious issues in banking, and lo and behold, what's happening in Parliament at the moment. But they've only been unpopular by the people who've been caught by them, speed cameras. Whistleblowers are only unpopular by the people who see them as a threat, the people they are challenging, the people whose actions they are exposing. Now, our speed camera was indeed sabotaged. They tried to set fire to it a few times. With whistleblowers, they don't actually set fire to them yet, but they do arrest them. They do march them out of the building without their jobs.
It depends very much on the nature of the instructions that the client is giving the solicitor, the relationship between the two. It might be a long-standing commercial relationship where the solicitor is working for someone within a firm, they've been working for a long time, it's a professional relationship. It doesn't seem to me that if there's consensual sexual relationship between those people, we necessarily have an ethical problem with it. But if the solicitor is representing someone who is perhaps seeking assistance to avoid a problem of domestic violence, then I think it's very different.
Voting again, a bit more interaction. What I want you to do is to think about the obstacles for lawyers disclosing errors. So we're talking about duty of candour, we talked about mid-staffs before, about the report that was prepared into that. The culture that existed in that organisation at that time discouraged openness, discouraged disclosure, discouraged owning up to mistakes. And as a consequence of that, that culture perpetuated very poor patient care over a prolonged period of time, resulting in probably undiscovered harm as well as the discovered harm over a prolonged period of time.
I should have put you get 3 votes for this one, so apologies. So 3 votes. We're going back to the 3 votes thing.
Thinking about lawyers, we've already talked about doctors and the standards that apply to them. I want you to think about the barriers to you owning up to an error or calling another person on their error.